Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to open our panel discussion and formally welcome our distinguished participants. We are joined today by three of Canada's mayors, each of whom has a long and exceptional history of public service in enhancing the quality of life of Canadians. Mayor Tory, Mayor Stewart, and Mayor Nenshi, welcome and thank you for making the time to be with us today. I would be remiss if I did not also take this opportunity to offer our sincerest gratitude for leading the fight against COVID-19 in your respective cities. Thank you for your principled leadership, for your commitment to the safety and health of Canadians, and for your ongoing efforts in steering us beyond the horizon of this crisis to what we all hope will be a stronger and a more united future. We're also honored to have here with us Dr. Daphne Taras, Dean of the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University, who has so graciously agreed to moderate today's discussion. Our discussion today provides the opportunity for us to reflect on the importance and relevance of the city in our everyday lives. We like to speak of Canada as a country, its ideals and values, but we often overlook the cities from which Canada obtains its character and pulse. The contours of everyday life are framed fundamentally by the city. From the issues of public transport to infrastructure, from meetings in City Hall to the voices in the public square, the city asserts an overwhelming influence on the quality of our lives. This is felt even more acutely today. The spread of COVID-19 has raised new challenges, prompted new concerns, and forced us as individuals, families, communities, and indeed cities to think critically and creatively about what the future holds. It is the city where the ideals we hold as society meet the realities of our lived experience. It is where the challenges of governance, of developing and sustaining community, and of cultivating diversity come alive in all their expressions. It is the city where, in the words of historian Lewis Mumford, the diffused rays of many separate beams of life fall into focus, with gains in both social effectiveness and significance. Before we begin, it will be appropriate to speak briefly about the Ismaili centers. The Ismaili centers in Vancouver and Toronto are two of 6 such centers worldwide. The others are located in the cities of Lisbon, Dushanbe, Dubai, and London. Cities that, much like those of Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto, contribute to society's global fabric, each drawing on their own respective histories, traditions, and cultures. The Ismaili centers serve as symbolic markers of the permanent presence and core values of Ismaili communities. Forged in a common spirit, each center's unique architecture is rooted in the rich tapestries of Muslim heritage and tradition. Their design is intended to reflect a mood of humility, forward outlook, and dialogue. As bridges of friendship and understanding, they serve to enhance relationships amongst diverse peoples, communities, government, and civil society. Their spaces serve as areas for social and cultural interaction, spiritual contemplation, as well as intellectual engagement and exchange. While we would be typically gathered in one of these centers for an event like this, the spirit of these centers and of this lecture series remains very much alive. The values they represent, the aspirations they embody, and the hopes they inspire are not limited to the confines of these buildings, but are meant to be shared, experienced, and discussed. It therefore gives me great happiness that we can do this virtually today. Thank you again for being with us today, and I look forward to what I'm sure will be an engaging discussion. Thank you.
I'll start by saying thank you, President Amir. All of us have been living through a whack-a-mole crisis in which leaders are surprised and aghast every day with pinch points. We've been delighted by new initiatives from staff. We're finding out things from the community about strengths and weaknesses, and ideas are flying. Trial balloons are launching daily, as we say in politics, but often the urgent presses out the important, and the important is what we're going to be talking about today. I have 6 questions for you. So I'll start with the first question. We've been hearing a lot of different ideas flying, but I want to hear from each of you 3 concrete initiatives that your city is doing that has achieved or that you're planning to do that will create long-term permanent improvement. So I want to know how you have used this crisis to advance permanent change in your cities. Who would like to start? Which of you? Mayor Tory.
I will just say that I think the single most important area in which we have established some things that are concrete and will be lasting, and the challenge will be to how to make them last, is in the partnerships we formed, which I'm not sure existed before, to help the most vulnerable people. So I'll take food security as an example. We've always had food banks, all cities do. We established in a hurry, during this pandemic, a network to provide for food security that was extraordinary in terms of the different options it allowed, such as the delivery to elderly people, food banks set up in libraries, which was, libraries are again at the hub in the community, and all kinds of different things like that that involved extraordinary partnerships between the private sector, the government, and the nonprofit sector. And I think that was repeated in other areas of care and support for the elderly, for example. Thousands of people got involved in, doing things as simple but as important as making sure elderly people who normally would have someone else calling on them but couldn't because of the pandemic, to make sure they were taking their medication or that they just weren't getting lonely. Mental health. We had an extraordinary partnership that allowed people to get right on the spot when they phoned 211, connected to a mental health professional right then and there, a hot transfer as they call it, that was someone that was drawn from a group that they might have belonged to. So we had a specific sensitivity to the concerns of Black Torontonians or LGBTQ or whatever. So these were things that we established. I'll go through the other 2 quickly because I know you don't want answers that are too long. Secondly, cycling infrastructure. I believe we will have. We will have installed in 2020 more cycling infrastructure than in any year in the history of the city, and that will be a lasting legacy for us to have on a go-forward basis. I think that was something that was true. And then thirdly, the whole area of digitization. We did things at wartime speed, as I call it, that would have taken months, years. In fact, sometimes it seemed never got done before, whether it ranged all the way from the ability to now to telework thousands of people up to 10,000 a day, whereas before we had almost none of that. All kinds of processes that are now online that weren't before, and you have to ask yourself why they weren't, but they just weren't, and now they are after 3 months. And even something like the management of personal protective equipment, masks and so on, we have a tool that was developed in a week. Developed in a week by our own IT department that allows us not only to manage the inventory, which I think before was done with clipboards and pens, but also allows it to adapt to the usage so that as you have maybe cases spiking up and more masks being used or whatever, this thing automatically then adjusts to what your inventory is, but also what you need in terms of ordering and so on. It's fairly straightforward, but it was something we just didn't have before. So those are 3 examples: digitization, hard infrastructure like cycling infrastructure, and then the softer infrastructure to look after vulnerable populations, all of which I hope we can maintain going forward so it isn't just a kind of flash in the pan temporary thing. In fact, we're committed to make sure that's not the case.
And can I go to Mayor Nenshi now?
Sure. Thanks so much, Daphne. Thanks to the Ismaili Center for hosting us today. Thanks to John and Kennedy for joining us for what I think will be a very critical conversation. So, from the very beginning in Calgary, we've been thinking about this crisis through 3 lenses. And in fact, now I've added a 4th lens. And those lenses are physical health, mental health, and economic health. And the 4th lens that I've added now is social health, because this pandemic, for whatever reason, has coincided with a very critical conversation that we need to have on how we move from being an inclusive and diverse community, a community that strives to be not racist, to a community that is actively anti-racist. And as you said, Daphne, all of this is coming at us at once. You know, we've had wildfires in Australia and locusts in Africa and a global pandemic affecting every single citizen, as well as murder hornets, and this critical conversation that we're having now about the future of our community as a community of opportunity for everyone. So that said, the first thing I should mention before I get into some of the more technical things the City of Calgary has done is to all of you watching, this has impacted every single one of us. Every single person in the world has been impacted in one way or another by this pandemic. I can't think of another thing that has been so close and so important to so many different people. And it's helped highlight for us a lot of the things we were doing right as communities and a lot of the things we were not doing right. So maybe I can go through a little bit in physical and mental health and in economic health, the work that we're doing. Probably economic health is the easiest one for us to get our heads around. We can't do a lot about the big macroeconomic things that are happening, the global recession and so on, but what we can do is help local businesses. And so we did what a lot of other cities did, deferred property taxes, helped in those ways in which we could. But we also really doubled down on our cutting of red tape, on thinking about our own permits and fees and so on. And my favorite example is when it became clear that restaurants could open at reduced capacity because of physical distancing, we very quickly, in fact, in just a couple of days, created a new system where restaurants could get pop-up patios or expand the size of their existing patio, because we know that outdoors is safer than indoors, and that this is a way that people might be able to make a little bit of business, a little bit of money in restaurants. Number two, and this is probably interesting only to John and Kennedy, but we very quickly altered our entire city management structure. We created these cross-functional task forces. One was focused on economic health, one was focused on community supports, one was focused on employee supports, because our cities are very, very large employers. We're the second largest employer in the city of Calgary. And one was focused on emergency response. We involved members of our council, as well as senior administration in these, to try and get to solutions more quickly, focused throughout the community. Now, the difference between me and Toronto, I actually don't know about Vancouver, is that public health is not a city responsibility in Alberta. So we don't have a public health department. So we were really both at the mercy of and partners with our provincial government in figuring out the physical health issues. So I talked about governance, I talked about patios. The third thing I want to talk about is mental health. And in terms of mental health, look, every one of us has been hit by this. And every one of us has found moments where we are angry, where we are grieving the way life used to be. That's okay, that's normal. But it's also highlighted that our mental illness and mental health interventions in our cities need to be focused not only on the moment of crisis, but need to be focused on mental health throughout the spectrum. And I had chosen it before this to make mental health and addiction the cornerstone of my third term as mayor, the creation of a new and better community plan on mental health. And this has really underscored that. So one of the things we were able to do was through what we're calling a fast pilot project, we were able to implement some 20-odd quick interventions on mental health that could really help people in different demographics work forward. And that's us trying to impact physical, mental, and economic health.
Mayor Stewart, you had a challenge from Mayor Nenshi to tell us more about Vancouver. So could you let us know what you've been doing?
Thanks very much, Daphne. And again, thanks to the Ismaili Center for having us here. And it's a great pleasure again to be on yet another Zoom call with John and Nahi. For us, the structure here in Vancouver is that we have our health authority is even more different than Toronto and Calgary, where we have regional health authorities. So I have a local head of the health department that we coordinate with, but they also have to coordinate with the province. So it is kind of par for the course out here in British Columbia, where we have lots of regional governance, different regional bodies. So it's a very fragmented approach to local governance here. But if I can just step back to to the COVID crisis, I mean, immediately it hit out here pretty early, and nobody quite knew. We'd seen what happened in Wuhan, but we hadn't been starting to see in Washington State from the cruise ships and those types of things, quite an increase in cases. And so actually on the same day, the province and myself as mayor declared a state of emergency, and we had 4 things that we were concentrating on. First was the overall kind of slowing down of the city of physical distancing, and that was a bit of a challenge because it was a pretty new thing for the population. They weren't taking it that seriously, and that was a bit of our job to kind of prod people to physically distance, to show that kind of leadership. But it caught on. People caught on pretty quickly. The second big challenge was with our vulnerable population. Here in Vancouver, we have the downtown east side, which is a very very poor neighborhood. We have about 7,000 injecting drug users just in the city, and an extremely vulnerable population. So we were terrified of COVID ripping through this population and causing mass death. So we quickly, once we had the kind of larger population under control and they were physically distancing, we put really everything we had into the downtown east side. So we took city resources and we were starting to clean private buildings. We were providing food. We were trying to do everything we could to physically distance. And then our regional health authority put in very strong surveillance measures to track COVID, and that was I think very effective. In fact, I think we only had 5 cases within that whole population, not a single death. Still, we also have a dual health emergency here. We have COVID, but we also have an overdose crisis where we're still losing after 4 years of being on a provincial health emergency. 1 person a day is dying due to overdose, due to a poison drug supply here. Fentanyl has ripped through all our drugs, and people who use drugs are dying, in huge numbers. So if we're going to concrete measures, then, I mean, one thing we've been really lobbying for a long time for the federal and provincial government was something called safe supply, which is an ability to substitute pharmaceutical, legal drugs for illegal drugs, and that has started to roll out through the COVID pandemic, and so, but it's temporary now, but we'd like to make it permanent, so we're working on that. So that's one really concrete change. Like the other cities, we really sped up our permitting process, really lopping parts off of requirements for those who are building or making changes to their patios or any kind of alterations to their businesses to allow them to adjust. And the third thing, I guess, and working with the 2 other mayors here on the call, was really working together to push Ottawa to do more for cities. And I think that's been a mixed result. We really haven't seen the kind of support we needed from the federal government, whether it's in operating funding or, for example, housing. We're still really struggling to secure housing funding from the federal government. So what I think is good, though, is that the Big City Mayor's Caucus especially is working very well together to pressure the federal government, but also at the provincial level. I think if one provincial government is kind of starts to move ahead with support for municipalities, that hopefully will have an impact on other provincial governments. So it's those are the things for response, and I guess we're just all going to wait and see how our local economies turn out, because we still have property taxes to collect. We don't know if people are going to default on the residential and the commercial side, and those are pretty scary things when you only have property tax really to fund most of your programs.
Thank you. I think we're all of us who are coping with all of this are going gray very, very quickly. I can tell you, I certainly am aging 3 days for every day I lived through COVID. So this is a question specifically for Mayor Nenshi. While all of us have been dealing with the pandemic, the city of Calgary and the province of Alberta have been particularly walloped by threats to the major industry, oil and gas, walloped by floods, by fire, by hail, by brimstone, by locusts, with COVID, death of the firstborn. There's very little that Calgary has not suffered through recently. Do you foresee any kind of sales tax or special levy or anything federal, provincial, city, federal? I mean, what is your plan to get yourself out of a particularly deep hole in Calgary? I say this as a Calgary resident and taxpayer.
I was going to say, you know Calgary very well, Daphne, and thank you so much for that question. In fact, you're right. I was joking at the beginning of this that in Calgary's 135-year history, we've had to declare a state of emergency exactly twice. And lucky me, I got to be the mayor for both of them. I also said at the beginning of all of this, because it is flood season, as we were working in our flood mitigation work with the federal and provincial governments has not yet been done 7 years after the floods of 2013. So at the beginning of this, I said, look, if we have a flood during a pandemic, I'm done. I get the hint. Jesus, take the wheel. I'm done. And then we did. So, and I'm still here. So there has been a lot that we have been managing through all of this. And, you know, I like to, at the beginning of this, I said Calgary was being hit by a triple whammy. And the triple whammy is the public health epidemic that we're all facing, and Calgary has been a bit of a hotspot for that. The second is the global recession, something that all cities are facing around storefront retail, around local businesses, and how many of those will be able to reopen. The third is, as you mentioned, being an innocent bystander in some power politics between Russia and Saudi Arabia in terms of the energy sector. The fourth is our other big industry here, of course, just like Toronto and Vancouver, is travel and tourism. And that industry has been shut down. In fact, this weekend should have been the opening weekend of the Calgary Stampede. That's $500 million in economic impact. Not happening. And then, of course, the fifth thing is this critical conversation that has come up in the middle of all of this around policing and how we move forward. So this has been rough. And so the city of Calgary has always been, if I say so myself, very well managed. We've got the lowest residential taxes in the country, among the lowest non-residential taxes. And like all cities, we never run a deficit. Well, this year, it's not as bad as Toronto, but this year, because of loss of transit, fares, loss of other revenues, and increases in costs, before any additional defaults, we will be looking at a deficit at the end of this year between $150 million and $240 million. If we have businesses that go out of business in default and they can't pay their taxes, the taxes were due on June 30th, but we've given people until September 30th to pay. And if we find a lot of defaults in that time period, we estimate that our deficit could be as high as $400 million on a $4 billion budget. So we're not supposed to run a deficit. Legally, we can't budget for one, but you can run one. But you do have to pay it back over the next couple of years. And as Kennedy mentioned, the only thing that we have to rely on is property tax, the most regressive, feudal, awful form of taxation. And the very last thing that we need, that citizens need going through what is bound to be a long recovery, is much higher property taxes or a significant reduction in our civic services at a time when they're needed the most. So ultimately, the only solution here is for the federal government and the provincial government to come to the table to provide us with a bit of a backstop to help us with our deficit for this year, and then we can manage things going forward. I will say that this week, Calgary City Council passed, not unanimously to my surprise, the findings of our financial task force, a group of citizen experts that we pulled together to help us think about long-term fiscal sustainability. And one of the things they recommended is, listen, you gotta decrease your reliance on the property tax. So that means that we have to have tough conversations, especially with our provincial governments, about what sources of revenue make sense for cities. And some of the people on my council, threw their hands up and said, no new taxes. We can't have a discussion about taxes, which is ridiculous because the tax we have right now is horribly unfair, particularly unfair to small business and particularly unfair to seniors who, through no fault of their own, have seen their house values go up while their income stays the same. So ultimately, I'm all in for a real conversation about tax reform, and I hope that our provincial governments and the federal government will be part of that too.
Well, I'm going to ask Mayor Nenshi for assistance from Mayor Tory and Mayor Stewart to give you advice on what they would do if they were in your shoes. Because as rotten as they have it, I'm not sure they have it as tough as you. And I just need to say that I was in Calgary when we had a stampede come hell or high water. To see it not go ahead this year is unbelievable. So what would you do?
Unbelievable for all of us.
It's unbelievable. What would you do? Help us, help. I'm living in Toronto now, so I'm sounding like a Calgarian, but Kennedy Stewart, what would you do if you were in Naheed Nenshi's shoes?
I think Naheed's doing a great job. I mean, the advocacy is really important. And I guess if I can add in this one additional complication about the property taxes, in Vancouver now, we're 50-50 renters and owners. So you have now a real split in the population where if you increase property taxes, it hits half the population and not the other half, because we also have a rental cap. So you can only increase rents by 2%, and as property taxes. And our population is every year it's 75% renters, 25% owners coming in. So the population is shifting dramatically towards a renter population who don't directly pay property tax. So this is, if there was ever a time now to have a discussion of different tools. So we talked to our U.S. colleagues who have a slice of sales tax. That's tougher in Alberta, where you don't have one, but here. You know, that is an answer, but again, this is going to be a decision for provincial and federal governments, because we've kind of stretched our limit. Most of in Vancouver, our budgets used to be kind of half provincial grants, like unconditional grants. That's disappeared completely. We don't have really any unconditional grants, so we've made it up in parking fees and those types of things. But I would say we're just at our max. We do, as long as development continues, we do get revenue from contributions from developers, but that doesn't go towards operating, and it goes towards capital investment. So we're really in a pickle, and if COVID's done anything, I think it's heightened the awareness, at least among the federal governments, about how something new has to happen here. I guess the scary thing is that we're starting to shut down our infrastructure projects now. So because we have to defer capital funding, we're looking at the list of things that we stop building, which doesn't bode well for the feds pumping money in to kickstart the economy with infrastructure spending. So we did warn them. We've been warning them for months now, all three of us here and other mayors across the city, across the country. But there really has been no response, and I'm really worried for the country that we won't be able to, put all this infrastructure money in place if it does come.
Well, thank you. I know myself, I'm mildly counter-cyclical so to hear the shutting down of infrastructure projects at exactly the time we need to kickstart an economy is tough to hear. Mayor Tory, what would you do if you were in Alberta?
Well, I would do exactly what Mayor Nenshi said he was doing, which is, I think, we can sit around and talk about all the programs we want that are going to help address whether it's economic or social or other kinds of challenges that face us. But if we don't have any money to deal with them, then we're either going with the begging bowl, which we seem to be doing with increasing regularity and with occasional success. But it's just not a satisfactory way of being able to plan or being able to put programs in place that have lasting value. And so I think, and it's a tough battle, we're all fighting it, and we have to fight it together and keep fighting it and not give up. We have to convince the other governments that they should either allocate, and I'll say it legislatively so that it's not something that's going to come and go depending on which budget is being brought forward, a share of their revenues to us, or allow us to create and be accountable for revenue sources we develop ourselves. It's interesting, in Toronto, the provincial government was convinced, for Toronto only, back in, I think it was 2006, to allow for the creation of a land transfer tax, a municipal land transfer tax. So when you buy a house, you pay the land transfer tax, and it's a graduated tax, so it's progressive depending on the value of the house you're buying. And today, so unfortunately you've paid it, and it's a large sum because it goes together with a provincial land transfer tax. But today, for us, that produces $800 million a year. And that's money we just didn't have before, and would have had to catastrophically. Our property tax raises $30 million per point. So if you think of how many points of property tax we'd have to add on to the tax bills of a lot of seniors and others, first-time home buyers who are operating on very precise budgets, whereas this is a tax that applies once in a while when you buy a house, assuming you don't buy them all that often, and it's a burden, but it nonetheless pays for a lot of transit and a lot of childcare, and I just think it's essential we be given tools that go beyond what Nahid correctly said is a regressive, feudal era tax that's there, and we have to use it because it's all we got, but we've got to go beyond that because we are delivering the services. We are the economic engine of the country. We are the frontline service providers during and outside of pandemics on almost every case. And while we shouldn't be paying through our own taxes for social programs, we need to have alternate sources of revenue even to do the job that we're doing and to do it properly.
Mayor Nenshi, just so you know, what would have cost $500 in the province of Alberta cost almost $100,000 in the province of Ontario. Mayor Tory is right. There is a heck of a difference in provincial revenues based on different tax schema. And this question is specifically for Mayor Tory. And I'm delighted to be living in Toronto now, one of the most truly urban, most densely populated cities in Canada. The pandemic has demonstrably removed cars from roads. It's changed traffic patterns. It's made Toronto Transit Commission GO Train. It's changed everything. It's changed patterns in those big skyscrapers. We're afraid to get in the elevators to get to the 45th floor. What will happen to real estate and the perceptions of real estate and city planning in the new normal? What from the pandemic will change the way Toronto thinks about density, transit, and real estate? Big question.
Well, it depends, I guess, on whether you're an optimist about coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic or not. I'm an optimist, and I believe that what was propelling Toronto to its status as the fastest growing city in North America, all of those fundamentals, and that's true in Calgary and Vancouver too. What is the best asset we have? The best asset we have is people, smart, educated people, who are here already in great numbers and who want to come from around the world. And I suspect when the borders reopen again, those people will want to come to Canada more than ever. I say oftentimes now that if people had a choice today, I believe this in my heart, and substitute Calgary or Vancouver for Toronto, but if they had a choice between Toronto, London, and New York, or Calgary, London, and New York, or Vancouver, London, and New York, they will pick the Canadian cities. Not all of them, but many, many will. And I think that's because of our way of life, our education system, how we've handled the pandemic, which hasn't been perfect, but I think has been pretty good when it comes to a role model for the rest of the world. So if you believe that we're going to be back to a position of strength, but that things will be different, then to me it only means you get on with doing what you were doing before. Build more transit, because there is no question but that with or without the pandemic, we were struggling to move people around. We have a transit system that presently moves 1.8 million people per day in normal times, which is extraordinary in Canadian terms, but we needed a lot more to protect the environment, to protect productivity in the economy, and so forth. And we had billions on the books, and it's still there, and the projects are actually still being built as we speak, but we need to get on with building the ones that were for the future. We have a terrific problem, as I know they do in Vancouver, I'm not so sure in Calgary, but with affordable housing. And we've had to take city land, we've had to take our regulations, we've had to take all those things and kind of look at different ways of doing them. By the way, having learned a lot of lessons and even stolen a couple of good people from Vancouver to help us get it done. Supportive housing, the same thing. I mean, there are people with special needs in our cities, a city as big as this and all of our big cities. Kennedy referred to some of them earlier. So I just think what we have to do is not try to transfix ourselves. I mean, yes, for the time being, it will be different to ride an elevator. And people will sort that out in one way or another. Yes, offices will reconfigure themselves, and it may well be the case some people never come back to work in the office towers. But you see, my view on that would be, well, that will cause some short-term dislocation. I believe the demand to come to Toronto when the borders are open again from people from around the world and to invest here and create jobs here will be such that that space and the law of supply and demand and market forces will cause it to be available and filled by someone else yet again. So I think, that there are lots of profound changes that will come our way because of the pandemic, but I'm going to keep my eye on trying to preserve the way in which we looked after our most vulnerable populations, as I indicated in the first answer to the first question, because I think we developed some unique partnerships there that allowed us to do a better job, deeper, and for more, but also making sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that I think while there will be differences in terms of how we live our lives day to day and even in some respects how business does business, that the fundamental attractiveness of our country will be there. I think there are things that have made it even more relatively attractive, and that I'm going to focus on getting those basics right. Building the transit, building the affordable housing, putting the supports in place for people who have issues, and expanding equality of opportunity. Because right now, if there's a big problem, the biggest problem Toronto has outside the pandemic, it is in the fact that this opportunity I talk about, the fastest growing city in North America, 186 high-rise projects under construction, et cetera, there'd be people living in our city now who would be hard-pressed to identify that any of that's happening where they live. And we've got to fix that, because they're smart, they're educated, they just don't have access to opportunity. So those are the things I'll be focused on, and not get myself quite as transfixed into changes that are going to take place in our way of life, which will be noticeable, will be granular, but I think will not obscure the fundamentals, which I think are going to be very sound when we come out of this.
Are there any things the mayors would like to say about plans in their cities, Calgary and Vancouver, for changes in either density and pedestrianization, in transit, in real estate, in answer to that question?
Well, I think John is right that this is a critical issue. By the way, you know, I'm also a professor in a business school, so I'm very excited to hear that you're in a hiring mode, because, you know, who knows how long I can handle all of these crises. Little while longer anyway. But that affordable housing thing, John, that's a big problem. And it's a big problem for us too, in a different scope and a different scale, but certainly an issue for us. I think that a lot of folks have been looking into a crystal ball, trying to forecast what the future of work is, what the future of transportation is, how people will imagine cities, the fact that we all love these Zoom calls so much that we'll just do that forever. And I think that's a bit of a foolish thing to do at the moment, because things are changing every day and every week. So we really don't know what will happen. I'm with John on this. I think that we will see a long-term revision to the mean here, while some companies will want more work from home opportunities and less space. Other companies will say, you know what, these open concept offices where we're jamming everybody into one big room is actually not safe for our employees. We actually have to have a little more space. So I think that things will start to move around. I don't know how we're going to solve the elevator issue. You know, if you're in a big skyscraper, it could take 3 to 4 hours for people just to get to their offices if we're restricting elevators. I know it sounds like a minor thing, but sometimes the minor things have a way to be the big things.
There's the answer.
So if we could get people to just change all of their hours. Oh, I see John is putting his mask on. I want to talk about that. Thank you, John.
Is it a medical grade mask for the elevator, or just a regular mask?
Nope. Just a mask that stops your droplets from getting out. But I think that answers the elevator question. Just a mask that stops you from coughing.
But it only works if everybody has one. And so, by the way, I will say this. I totally applaud John and the GTA mayors for their leadership in moving forward with a mandate for mask wearing indoors. I think that's really important. And I think we have to learn to get to a new normal, because if we want to revert to the mean, if we want to be able to get our lives back to something like they were before, though I believe we should be building back stronger and better, that's going to require changes in our own behavior. And one of those changes is the wearing of the mask, which we have to remember. The mask doesn't protect me. It protects other people from me. So it is not a sign of fear or giving in to wear a mask. It's actually a sign of community. It's a sign of service, to say I care enough about other people in my community that I'm going to make this small sacrifice to keep them safe. These are the things we got to think about, because ultimately we could go on all day about the future of transit and the built realm and how we think about public space and how we think about people reverting to the automobile because it's a bubble of safety. I don't think that stuff is interesting as much as thinking about how human behavior in cities might change in order to make sure we're keeping everyone safe and keeping the economy humming.
Mayor Stewart.
Yeah, well, as the kind of COVID challenges pause a little bit, I'm very worried about a second wave, as you're seeing it, and especially with the U.S. numbers going where they're going. But really, with the pause on COVID, really, we're kind of back to where we were before, working on our agenda, and it's mostly the missing middle in terms of housing. That what we've been really trying to do is put in policies that essentially bend the market to deliver housing on private land for folks that make, that they can't afford full market rents. And so we're starting to have some success with those projects, which is really good. So we, we're starting to provide housing for those making between kind of $30,000 and $50,000 a year in small little numbers. But what's cool is that the developers are starting to put forward these projects, have them approved, and start getting them built, which is great. And that comes with nothing else from the federal or provincial governments, really. That just comes from us using our rezoning tools and ability to add density. So that's good, except what we're finding is we have no ability to provide housing for folks making minimum wage. We can't bend the market far enough to even get new rental properties for folks that are making minimum wage, and the government subsidized units provide for folks that are on shelter rate, on the social assistance, maybe a little higher than that, but there's this whole gap of the working poor that we're not building any new housing for. So as we're tearing down the old stuff that's 75, 100 years old, we're not replacing that. And so that's forcing more and more people out into the suburbs and away from our core. And then you think, well, that's really inefficient. I mean, we need to have neighborhoods that are mixed. And so that is the big challenge. And that's really where our attention's back to now. I think people are saying, they would rather live in complete neighborhoods as well. They'd like to live in a neighborhood where they can walk to a store and walk to their schools and walk to the, so that's also a rethinking that's happening here. Is I don't know if it's quite, I know Montreal, they're trying the 15-minute neighborhood, that you can walk to everything in 15 minutes, but I do think that's the spirit of what we're trying to do here, and a lot of credit to my predecessor, Gregor Robertson, with his council's large investments in bike lanes and reducing space for cars has actually paid off during this pandemic, and we're seeing a huge uptick in bicycle traffic, which is good.
But Mayor Stewart, you get the pleasure of the next question. And you had started by talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion with vulnerable populations, and these matters have really intensified since the murder of George Floyd and since Breonna Taylor's demise. How is Vancouver creating plans for the new normal that are keeping vulnerable groups included in the economic power of that city? I mean, what is happening now in the last few months that is new? It may not be COVID. It may be a question about Black Lives Matter, Indigenous people, but what is happening new in Vancouver?
Well, I think, over the last 5 or 6 years, Vancouver's starting to build in a lot of kind of equity audits and looking at all what we do through different lenses, not just the economic lens, but again, how does it play out throughout the population, and trying to make policies that are more equitable. With more or less success, I think really identifying problems is the first thing you need to do. But I have to admit, this city really needs to do a lot more. When it comes to policing, for example, we've got kind of a real controversy brewing here where, for example, on street checks, we did make some changes. I'm also the chair of the police board here, so the board did make some changes in terms of reducing the number of street checks, which were found to be inequitably distributed. Basically, Indigenous folks, 3% of the population, but 16% of the checks. Black folks were 1% of the population, 6% of the checks. And so, but really after the George Floyd incident, and of course lots of marches and outcry, we looked at the stats and we found that with our changes, we've reduced street checks by about 90%. But I think they should just be abolished, and I've said that, and actually I have a motion coming to council next week where we'll debate this, and then the police board will also talk about this. But I really think there's some big moves that need to be made there. Police don't always agree with this, and so that is part of the controversy that's coming here as well. There has been a huge, I think, not a very useful discussion around defunding the police. I think it's really, these guys are bad, so let's take all their money away is not the way to talk about this. More importantly, though, it's how do we most effectively deliver services for those who are disadvantaged. And so maybe having police, show up to if a business finds somebody who's homeless on their under their awnings, maybe it's not best for police to show up. Maybe it's better for another crew of people, psychologists, nurses, to show up instead. And so that's the discussion we're having here: is how do we change our services to be more equitable. And of course, because of our homeless population, large homeless population here, it's not equitably distributed. It's overwhelmingly Indigenous, and our services has to be custom made to really reflect the needs of those population. That's everything from how they first enter into the system, how they go through in terms of assistance, the types of housing we have. Little 300-foot rooms doesn't work if you're more communal in nature. So that's really what we're identifying, and I know Toronto is kind of going through the same debate at this point. But I think, we got housing crisis, overdose crisis, COVID, and now this is in a way it turns what Nahid's saying is it's a social cohesion. Not a crisis, but it is an emerging issue it's come back to the top, and we really have to get a handle on this and make some concrete moves to address it.
And Mayor Tory, would you have anything to say on this topic for Toronto?
Well, I think, I could tell you our circumstances are much the same as what Kennedy described in Vancouver, but I think the point he made just towards the end there was very, very important. These things all really come together. I mean, why should it surprise us? We were just looking at we actually agreed, and our province did not, but the City of Toronto said it was going to collect and analyze race-based data with respect to COVID-19. And does it really come as any surprise when we begin to do that after the first month or so of collecting data that disproportionately the poorer and neighborhoods, which also happen to be populated by racialized communities and so on, are the ones where there's been a higher rate of infection, because they are also housed in a way that is we describe it as not suitable housing. In other words, if you have a family of 7 people living in a 400 square foot apartment, you're going to have a lot of trouble if one person tests positive, isolating yourself from the other 6 people you live with. And the kind of work you do probably makes you more susceptible to being in a workplace where you're going to be more susceptible to being infected. And that goes all the way through to a host of the other issues that Kennedy was alluding to, which have to do with policing and have to do with school dropout rates, and the issue I mentioned earlier, which is access to the opportunity. We had a booming tech sector here. Well, you could go and tell that to some of the kids that live in the predominantly black neighborhoods in the northeast and northwest of Toronto, and how do you think that opportunity is going for you? And it's not because anybody sort of consciously denied them the opportunity, but we didn't take the steps to actually say, all right, we're going to make sure that those kids know about this opportunity, because they've all gone to the best public education system in the world, our Canadian system, taken across the provinces. And so the issues have all come together and now have been sort of had a spotlight shone upon them because of some of these other incidents that involve blatant systemic and other kinds of racism, which have always existed. These are not new things. We created an anti-black racism unit, the first in North America, in Toronto, I guess about 3 years ago, because we knew that there were still things going on in government, in policing, and elsewhere in the city that needed to be sort of taken on in an organized way with specific focus from the city government. So I just think that there's a menu in front of us which does not have to do with our fundamental strengths, which are there, as we discussed earlier. It has to do with affordable housing. It has to do with transit, because the areas that became marginalized and isolated are in some respects isolated and marginalized because they don't have decent transit system. So the transit plan remedies that. But all of these dots are connected. Mental health. I mean, if we provided people with more support with regard to their mental health issues, and again, disproportionate suffering of mental health issues among, say, a black population or a racialized community, then we will have more people available to fuel the economy. Those people will be able to get better jobs because they'll be employable, because they'll be able to cope with their issues, because they got support, and so on. So I just think this is the challenge that's in front of us in the next, pick a number of years you want, but today and tomorrow and going all the way forward, is how to remedy a number of those inequities to make sure we're treating those people in a way that Canadian values would suggest we would want to, but also that we're at full strength in terms of being able to take on the world for jobs, for investment, for prosperity, which in turn fuels our ability to finance social programs.
Well, I'm going to now turn to very personal questions to each of you. A very personal question. For each mayor, how have you been finding the inner strength to deal with this crisis? It's been challenging every single one of us to the max. Do you have a kind of a credo or a statement, a set of guiding core values? Do do you have a mantra that you go through after one day at a time, one day at a time? I mean, what are you using yourself to build strength to be a leader at this time? So we want to know your secret mantra. You laughed first, Kennedy Stewart. You tell us your secret mantra.
I don't know if I have a secret mantra. I mean, it's just trying to get up and survive each day. This is, I mean, I rely so much on the calls I have with other mayors because this is a new job for me. I was a federal politician for 7 years in opposition, which is a much different job than leading a city. And I'm only 20 months into this thing, so it's with so for me, I think when it really hit in February, I thought, okay, I'm just gonna have to take risks here, and if I make the wrong choices and don't get reelected, that's just the way it goes. I think the choices have been mostly right for now, but really, it's I would just say my wife is the total reason I survived this. She's just so incredible, and also a political scientist like me, so we really enjoy this, figuring through the politics of all this stuff. But it's also staying very focused, I think, on the most vulnerable communities, waking up every morning and thinking, like, okay, I'm okay today, but these folks are the ones that need the most help, and they're in the most difficulty, and even coming out of this, they're still in the most difficulty. So that's, I guess thinking about other people is really why you get into these jobs in the first place, and I'm sure my colleagues share that sentiment, but it's also what keeps you focused as you're going through this.
You know, every day there's whack-a-mole, so keep your eye on the long. What about you, Mayor Tory? What's your secret sauce?
I don't know what the song is, but I mean, to me, as somebody mentioned earlier on, one day at a time, and I think that is fundamentally important. I remember when I ran a big company, it was never the big issues that got me, sort of upset. It was some tiny little trivial thing. And if you focus on the big issues, on taking it one day at a time and realize that there is tomorrow, and that if you've made a little bit of progress today, you'll make more tomorrow. Secondly, and I believe this is true, these sound like truisms, but they are, is teamwork and taking good advice. I mean, this has been a health crisis. I am not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a healthcare expert. And so I have taken the good advice of our medical officer of health, and that has stood me in good stead all the way through. Even sometimes when it was uncomfortable, I asked a lot of questions, but I took the advice without exception in the end. And then thirdly, I think to remind yourself of making sure you are applying the help that you can offer to the people who need it the most. And if you do all those three things, and that's not the only three, then I think it allows you to put your head down on the pillow at night and saying, I helped the people who needed help the most. I did it based on the advice of the people who know the most about how to handle something like this, which is a pandemic which none of us have ever had to face before, and certainly not those who aren't doctors and healthcare people. And I did it with a team, and I did it on the basis of saying it's one day at a time. This is something that very much required you to be patient and to just say, this is not going to be over overnight. It's still not. And that as long as we're making a little bit of progress every day. So, I mean, to me, those things, especially the presence of a team and expert advice, allowed me to remain basically totally calm throughout, except perhaps the day they told me in a presentation that thousands of people in the city of Toronto alone would die. When have we ever heard such a thing in Canada? We haven't heard, we've had terrible tragedies like with drug overdoses, but if you look at homicides and pedestrian collisions and things like that, which we rightfully get horrified about, there are nowhere near numbers like that. And so that day I just determined, fine, we're going to do everything we can, some of it not very popular, based on expert advice, to make sure that we try and stop this from happening. And we didn't entirely stop loss of life, but we minimized it compared to what we were told would be the case.
So not to minimize what you said, but it sounded a little bit like Annie. Tomorrow is only, but with a lot of trying to make a difference. Mayor Nenshi, you know my theme now. What do you do to get through?
Well, my very first TikTok video was me singing the song Tomorrow, telling people how long they should wash their hands for. I feel like this entire conversation has been a marvelous ad for why you should run for mayor. Doesn't this sound like a great job? They said it would be fun. They said, run for mayor, they said. It is a great job. And that is, in fact, what keeps me going, is reminding myself that, like you've heard from Kennedy and John, we don't have all the answers, but we're surrounded by people who do. And not just the experts, but the people in our community. I am inspired every day by the stories of what people have just figured out how to do. somebody set up a Facebook site on day one, Calgary COVID-19 volunteers. It had 20,000 members by the end of the week. And it just became a way that citizens looked out for one another. This is what I need. This is my problem. And citizens would just figure it out. The day that the province closed the restaurants, a young woman in Calgary called Lourdes Swan, who has a little organization called the Leftovers Foundation, sprung into action. We were able to connect her with the school bus drivers who had nothing to do because the schools were closed. And she collected all the food from all the restaurants that had just been closed and were able to redistribute some 10,000 pounds of food, if I got my number right. These are the sorts of things that make a difference every day. And that's where I draw my inspiration from, whether it's the dedicated civil servants who work for the city, my colleagues at the City of Calgary, whether it is the healthcare workers, or whether it is the people in the economy that we never remember are in the economy. So, John and I know one another from the world of management consulting and finance and telecom. And here's the thing. Nobody really needs a management consultant right now. Nobody needs a securities lawyer right now. And I heard someone say on the radio the other day, this reminds us more of Sesame Street than a job fair, because the jobs you learn about on Sesame Street are the important ones. The people who work in grocery stores, the truck drivers, the people who work in warehouses, the people who are the poorest paid people in our community, the people who look after our elderly. And one thing that I draw, it's not a happy thing, but something that keeps me going in times like this is to remind myself of the incredible work that is left to be done. And so we have to describe to ourselves something that we've never wanted to say out loud, which is in all three of our cities, we have allowed an under economy to be created that is largely an economy of immigrants and refugees, that is largely an economy of women, but not entirely, who are paid crap, who are doing the jobs other people don't want to do. And for example, they work in the long-term care homes, go early in the morning, change our elderly relatives' diapers. They're only given 30 hours a week so that they don't have to be paid benefits. So in order to help their family get by, they either have to have another job to do another 30 hours a week without benefits to get to 60, or they have to rely on informal cash work. And then we blame them for saying, well, you can only work at one long-term care home. How dare you have this other job to try and feed your family? You're dangerous. You're spreading the pandemic. And so ultimately, we've allowed that to happen. And part of this pandemic is a conversation for us saying, it's time to fix things. And that inspires me too. I don't know if there's a good song lyric for that.
I was trying for the song. I was also thinking in Alberta of the possibility of cross-contamination between meatpacking kill sites and nursing homes because of the vulnerability of people who work in both. So
we know that's true.
It's
We've
very
had three major outbreaks in Calgary, and they were actually all the same outbreak. Because you had people at a prayer meeting who worked at a long-term care home, whose colleagues at the long-term care home had spouses who worked at the meat plant.
Yeah, I would be doing my network
so this is
analysis.
all part of the economy we don't talk about.
As an academic, as a labor relations professor, I can explain some of the outbreaks because of the family structures. But anyway, I have another question. And this is my last question. If you had a 22-year-old son or daughter, if you had a child, and right now they were extremely stressed about the future. They were graduating, let's say, there are no jobs being posted. They've lost the dream of the job that was going to be posted. Tell me what you would say right now to your child to keep their spirits up. Starting with, I don't know, John Tory.
I would say take strength from your family and the people who love you and support you in the first instance, because we all have to have a foundation, and for most people that's the kind of bedrock at the end of the day if the jobs are gone or other things don't seem to be going that well. But secondly, I would say be an optimist. I mean, you are living in Canada. We are so blessed to live here. We're incredibly privileged and lucky. We have a system of education that very same 22-year-old one thinks would have been through or still in. And that this is going to position us, given everything about this country, the social supports we have, the educational system, the economic opportunity, the proximity, frankly, to the United States, without which we would not be able to have the prosperity we do. So be an optimist. Secondly, remember at all times, do not ever forget, and I started remembering this when I was a volunteer starting when I was a teenager, remember the thin line that separates you with all that, sort of opportunity that is to be Canadian from, even in this country, being on the streets, being homeless, being unemployed, being faced with mental health or addiction issues, or on we could go. And don't ever forget that, today's comfort could be tomorrow's despair, and that could happen to all of us, and does happen to some of your neighbors and co-workers and friends and relatives. And then thirdly, and arising out of something the head just said a moment ago, solidarity. We have seen when we've gone through trials, whether it's the Humboldt situation or whether it was our Yonge Street massacre or now this pandemic which we've shared across the country, that when we're in solidarity with one another and we actually engage ourselves in helping our fellow human beings as fellow human beings, not because they're any other common descriptor, and when we do these volunteer programs and sign up for the kinds of things that were referred to earlier, we can battle any adversity together. And indeed, we should be doing that all the time, not just during a pandemic, because there are crises being faced by people in big cities like the three of ours all the time, in war, in peacetime as well. And so I think if you follow that, optimism, remember the thin line at all times, and then when everybody falls over the thin line, as has happened in the pandemic, band together, because it's a truism or one of those statements, but together we can get through anything, I believe, as if we look after each other.
And Mayor Nenshi, the Ismaili community is always concerned with the future of their children. If you're looking at Ismaili youth in Calgary, as I think we both did many years ago, what would you tell them right now?
Much as what John has to say is, even though it doesn't feel like it right this minute, we are unbelievably lucky to be here. We're unbelievably lucky to be here. And we've seen tough times before. I get it. When I graduated university, I graduated into a deep global recession. Very few people in my graduating class had jobs in their field. I had to move to Toronto. That's how bad it was. But at the same time, we get to live here. And we've just had Canada Day, and I know for a lot of people this was a conflicted moment in history. But I got to tell you, there is nowhere in the world that I would rather be tackling these issues. There is nowhere in the world where I would rather be focusing on a brighter future for all than right here. And that's our opportunity. So if you're a 22-year-old Canadian, you've been educated, it may not feel like you've got a ton of privilege as you're out there pounding the pavement or working in something that is not what you dreamed to do, but your opportunity is extraordinary. And as I always say, real change in the world doesn't come from good-looking politicians like John and Kennedy giving great speeches. It comes from everyday people using our everyday hands, our everyday minds, and right now especially our everyday voices to make change. So if you're 22, let's make some change.
And Kennedy, what would you do to top this?
Well, not trying to top it. I think those are great lessons. I think that I just cast my mind back, and I think probably the most valuable lessons I had were from my elders. And I remember as a kid, I lived with my great uncle Evan, who fought in World War I and World War II. And the lessons you learn from maybe not the generation just prior to you, but the one before, are the important things, because those folks went through a lot of tough things. You think World War I, Great Depression, World War II. And I think the focus is, for example, not on materialism, not to think about the things that you can amass, but the experiences you can have and the things you can learn. So, learning it formally at universities, colleges, going back and getting your high school if you don't have it, that kind of stuff. It's a great time to do that. But also to talk to elders about what really is important in life. And perhaps it's... maybe it used to be buying a condo in Calgary, Vancouver, or Toronto, but maybe that's not it. Maybe there are, if those things are out of reach, there's a way to have great life, and I think you'll get that from the 20th century elders that have those lessons to share. So that's what I would think. Take some time, call your grandparents, call somebody else's grandparents if you don't have them, if yours aren't around anymore. Absolutely. Yeah, just have a conversation. How did you survive a really tough time? How did you survive the threat of nuclear war all the way through the Cold War? How did you pick up my in-laws moved from Belfast to to first Toronto and then Vancouver, they had nothing. And then how did they do that? And I think those are lessons that a 22-year-old should have right now.
With no Zoom, no contact, 3 months before a letter got to you, no security, no supply chain. I remind our faculty, staff, and students in my city that I live in at Ryerson, it wasn't more than 3 months ago that you were all out hoarding food, thinking that you would be starving. And now we're talking about a difference that young people are making as volunteers and taking food around. And it's just so profoundly not desperate right now that, you know, I have a hard time with it. Anyway, I'm going to close by saying that, you know, I'm just very grateful to be in this country, but I'm very grateful for food security. I'm very grateful that we're able to go out and find food and find places for it. And I'm going to summarize at least what I heard from some of the things that you three said. I want to, first of all, thank you so much. For me, it was such a privilege to get to know you better, but also you're about a third of Canada. So I added up the populations of each of your cities and divided it by, you know, the total in Canada. I came up with some percentage. And this is a big chunk of Canada we've just been talking about. So I just want to acknowledge that these are 3 giant cities. And when you're talking about experimentation and advice and new things, that's millions of people affected by the types of things you're saying. So what I heard was, as a result of COVID, number one, the speed of change, the speed of necessary change, the cutting of red tape, the not tolerating excuses is huge. And cities were able to do things that were unbelievable quickly because it needed to be done. The second thing I heard was a need for coordination, much more coordination within your own management teams, within yourselves and your province, with Ottawa, and even among the big city mayors. I heard a wonderful phrase that the big city mayors meet. So for everybody that thinks that Canada is disparate, no, you guys have meetings and share good ideas, and I think that's a really important thing. I heard a lot about vulnerable populations. I heard about fentanyl. I heard about safe supply. I heard about physical distancing. I heard about the space that people live in and is it adequate to do safe distancing and how your minds are on it. And I want to thank you for that. I heard about deficits and I don't know how we're going to solve them. But it's not the first time the world has had deficits, and everybody is pretty optimistic that somehow over time we will find solutions. And a lot on economic health and what we're going to do to try to recover and get a footing. And I heard from you that we will return to normal. It might be a little different, but there's a lot of reason for optimism. We're a country that has huge demand, takes in immigrants. People still want to move to us. And to some extent, that will also stabilize opportunities. And the final thing I heard is that, or at least I'm going to end by saying we're all really tired of Zoom, and we're all tired of meets, and we're all so tired of not touching each other and shaking hands and, you know, meeting over dinner. But I'm optimistic that we are going to find joy again. We're very, all of us are very, we're soldiering through this crisis. We're coming up with great ideas and solutions, but we will find joy again. I don't know when, but I want to hear about finding joy the next time we talk. So I want to thank you so very much for the time you've spent with the Ismaili community. And it's just been a wonderful conversation, and I sure appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all.
The Ismaili Centers, too, very much for having us all here. Great.
What an engaged community.
For sure.